The Battle of Rzhev, often overshadowed by more renowned confrontations on the Eastern Front, occupies a distinct and harrowing place in the chronicles of the Second World War. Nestled west of Moscow, the Rzhev salient became a focal point of intense military operations between Soviet and German forces from January 1942 through March 1943. It was not a single battle, but a series of offensives and counteroffensives in a region that acquired the grim nickname the Rzhev Meat Grinder. Before the opening shots echoed through the forests and marshlands, the geopolitical environment had already primed the region for devastation. Following the failure of Operation Barbarossa to deliver a decisive blow in 1941, German forces settled into a strategic realignment. The Wehrmacht had advanced perilously close to Moscow, but was repelled by a determined Soviet counteroffensive in the winter. Hitler's Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, withdrew slightly and entrenched along the Rzhev-Vyazma salient, a 150-kilometer bulge in the front line that was both a threat to the Soviet capital and a liability for the Germans. The salient stretched German lines dangerously thin, yet Hitler refused to relinquish it, believing its proximity to Moscow provided strategic leverage and symbolic power. For the Soviets, recovering lost territory and securing the approaches to Moscow were national imperatives. The Red Army, under the overall command of Georgy Zhukov and other senior generals, was under political and military pressure to expel the invaders. The Stavka, the Soviet High Command, prioritized repeated offensives in the Rzhev sector despite the costs. Soviet planners recognized the logistical and topographical challenges of the region. Dense forests, rivers, and inadequate transport infrastructure, but saw no alternative. The morale of the Red Army and the civilian population, still reeling from the Nazi onslaught of 1941, demanded a counterstrike. The strategic significance of Rzhev was compounded by the broader context of the Eastern Front. In early 1942, while the Soviets were still recovering from immense losses, the Wehrmacht retained much of its offensive capacity. German divisions were well-equipped, experienced, and adept at defensive warfare. However, the Red Army's growing manpower, supported by mass mobilization and increased war production, began to offset some of these disadvantages. Soviet factories, relocated eastward beyond the Urals, were now churning out tanks, artillery, and aircraft in quantities that surprised German intelligence assessments. Public sentiment in the Soviet Union was a mixture of determination and weariness. Propaganda emphasized heroic defense and the liberation of occupied territories, but among the rank and file, memories of catastrophic encirclements and retreats remained vivid. In the German Reich, the initial triumphalism of 1941 was giving way to a grimmer realization that victory in the East would not come swiftly. Reports from the front grew more ambiguous, and censorship increased to mask the scale of losses and setbacks. Intelligence failures and strategic miscalculations were not limited to one side. German command underestimated the resilience and adaptability of Soviet formations, often dismissing them as disorganized masses rather than a maturing military machine. Conversely, Soviet planners at times overestimated the readiness and morale of newly formed units. Many divisions were rushed into combat with insufficient training or logistical support, a factor that would contribute to the appalling casualty rates in the coming months. The terrain around Rzhev posed unique challenges. Unlike the open steppes further south, this was a landscape of dense woods, frozen rivers, and marshy ground, difficult for mechanized formations and prone to bogging down supply routes. The bitter winters compounded these difficulties, as frostbite, equipment failure, and logistical delays plagued both sides. Moreover, the civilian population in the region, caught between the front lines, faced severe hardship. Many villages were evacuated or destroyed, and the infrastructure was heavily damaged by artillery and bombing raids. By the beginning of 1942, the stage was set for a grinding war of attrition. Both Soviet and German leadership believed that control of the Rzhev sector could alter the strategic balance on the Eastern Front. For the Wehrmacht, it was a buffer zone and a launch point for potential future operations. For the Soviets, it was a dagger aimed at the heart of their capital. Thus, the Rzhev salient became a crucible in which ideologies, armies, and entire divisions would be tested, often to destruction. The context surrounding the Battle of Rzhev reveals a microcosm of the broader Eastern Front. Two vast armies locked in a death struggle, each convinced of the righteousness of its cause, each willing to expend hundreds of thousands of lives to claim dominance over a patch of devastated terrain. The events that would soon unfold in this bleak and bitter corridor would serve as a testament to the brutality and complexity of total war, and to the enduring consequences of decisions made far from the front lines. In early 1942, the Soviet High Command initiated a bold attempt to collapse the Rzhev salient through a series of coordinated offensives. The initial thrust came as part of the larger Soviet Winter Campaign, targeting the overstretched German lines across a broad front. The Kalinin and Western Fronts, under commanders Ivan Konev and Ivan Yeremenko respectively, were tasked with breaking the salient from the north and east. Despite the confidence in the Red Army's newfound momentum following the defense of Moscow, the opening phase of the operation quickly revealed the immense difficulty of the task. The terrain around Rzhev was a defensive planner's dream. German engineers had spent months fortifying the salient with interconnected trench systems, bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and extensive minefields. Artillery was positioned with overlapping fields of fire, and many positions were camouflaged or hidden within forests and ravines. The Wehrmacht's ability to hold such an exposed position relied on this defensive depth, bolstered by interior lines of communication that allowed rapid redeployment of reserves. Soviet forces, while numerically superior, were hampered by logistical deficiencies and rushed planning. Coordination between different fronts was imperfect, and many divisions found themselves attacking without adequate artillery preparation or air support. In some cases, units lacked proper winter clothing or heavy weapons, leading to avoidable attrition before contact with the enemy. Nevertheless, the attacks began in earnest in January 1942, with thousands of Soviet troops advancing into deep snow under withering German fire. German resistance was fierce. Commanders such as General Walter Model, who would gain a reputation for his skill in defensive operations, orchestrated flexible countermeasures. German forces often allowed Soviet troops to overextend, then launched localized counterattacks to encircle and annihilate forward elements. The Wehrmacht also benefited from its continued superiority in communications, allowing faster adaptation to shifting battle conditions. The Soviets managed to achieve some tactical breakthroughs, particularly in the sectors around Sikevka and Zubtsov. However, these gains were limited and came at an extraordinary cost. The German line bent, but did not break. Instead of a swift collapse, the Soviet offensive ground into a war of position, where trenches changed hands repeatedly and villages were captured and lost within days. Artillery duels turned entire swaths of land into cratered wastelands, and the death toll mounted steadily. On the Soviet side, commanders continued to receive orders to press the attack, often with reinforcements rushed into battle before they could be properly integrated. The belief at the strategic level was that the Germans could be worn down by sheer attrition. But this theory underestimated the Wehrmacht's tenacity and ability to rotate frontline units. Moreover, Soviet intelligence often failed to account for the depth of German fortifications and the mobility of their armored reserves. By February, the initial Soviet momentum had stalled. Supply lines were overstretched, and morale among frontline units was deteriorating. Ammunition shortages became common, and the cold inflicted thousands of non-combat casualties. The hoped-for encirclement of the salient remained elusive, and Soviet forces began to dig in, bracing for counterattacks that inevitably followed each offensive wave. For the German High Command, the Rzhev salient remained a dangerous liability. Field Marshal von Kluge and others argued for a partial withdrawal to shorten the line. But Hitler insisted on holding the position at all costs. He viewed any retreat as a blow to German prestige, and feared that relinquishing the salient would open the path to Smolensk and beyond. This intransigence condemned German troops to a prolonged and bloody defense in one of the most inhospitable environments of the front. Among soldiers on both sides, the battle became synonymous with futility. Accounts from survivors describe days of ceaseless shelling, frostbite, and death. The forests around Rzhev, once filled with pine and birch, were reduced to splinters. The Volga tributaries ran dark with silt and human remains. Civilians who had not evacuated were trapped in a limbo of hunger and terror. Their villages turned into strongpoints or flattened by artillery barrages. As winter turned to spring, neither side held a decisive advantage. The Soviet High Command began reassessing its approach, and planning for further operations resumed. But the failure to achieve a strategic breakthrough in the initial phase of the Rzhev operations foreshadowed the protracted and grinding nature of the battles that would continue into the summer and beyond. It became clear that this would not be a campaign of swift maneuver, but one of attrition measured in blood and shattered divisions. The lines barely shifted, but the cost was catastrophic, and the worst was still to come. With the failure of the initial Soviet winter offensives to eliminate the Rzhev salient, attention turned to renewed planning in the spring and summer of 1942. The Stavka, undeterred by the staggering losses of the early attacks, maintained its strategic objective of cutting off and destroying the German forces entrenched around Rzhev and Sychevka. The planning phase for the next major offensive, designated Operation Mars, was launched under the overall supervision of Marshal Georgy Zhukov. This operation would become one of the most ambitious Soviet undertakings of the war, even as it was overshadowed by concurrent preparations in the south for Operation Uranus, the offensive that would encircle the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Operation Mars was conceived as a coordinated assault by multiple Soviet armies striking the flanks of the Rzhev salient in a pincer movement. The Western Front under Colonel General Ivan Konev, along with the Kalinin Front under Colonel General Maxim Purkayev, were assigned the task of breaching the German lines and linking up deep within the salient to encircle the defenders. Soviet planners anticipated that a successful execution would trap over 300,000 German troops and collapse Army Group Center's entire western position. But the complexity of the operation, combined with underestimation of German defensive strength and overconfidence in Soviet capabilities, planted the seeds of failure before the first shot was fired. The German Ninth Army, commanded by General Walter Model, had not been idle during the Soviet planning. Intelligence intercepts and reconnaissance had alerted the Germans to possible Soviet preparations, prompting extensive reinforcement of defensive lines. New bunkers, minefields, and anti-tank emplacements were added. The terrain itself favored the defender. Swampy ground, narrow forest paths, and few roads made large-scale armored movements hazardous. Moreover, Model's command style emphasized elastic defense, allowing local commanders some flexibility in adapting to Soviet tactics. Logistics for Operation Mars presented further obstacles. The Red Army had grown in numbers and industrial support, but supply chains remained fragile. Roads were poor, and spring thaws turned the ground to mud. Troops had to contend not only with difficult movement, but also with coordination challenges between units. Communications equipment was in short supply, and plans for combined arms operations often broke down under the stress of battle. On 25 November 1942, the offensive began with artillery barrages across the front. Soviet infantry and tank units surged forward, attempting to breach the first line of German defenses. In some sectors, especially near Bely and the Vazuza River, early progress was made. However, the Germans quickly mounted counterattacks. The Wehrmacht's mobile reserves, including panzer divisions and assault gun units, were deployed with precision to contain and roll back penetrations. Soviet units that pushed deep were soon isolated, surrounded, or destroyed. Particularly devastating were the encounters between Soviet tank brigades and well-prepared German anti-tank defenses. In the narrow forest corridors, Soviet armor became easy prey for hidden PaK-40 guns, mines, and close-range ambushes. Infantry advances suffered similarly. Entire rifle divisions were decimated in attempts to storm fortified positions. Repeated frontal assaults achieved minimal gains and resulted in staggering casualties. Communication breakdowns led to units being sent into sectors already lost or overrun. By early December, the offensive had clearly failed to achieve its strategic aims. While localized gains were made and German casualties were not insignificant, the bulk of Army Group Center remained intact. The Soviet command hesitated to acknowledge the scale of the failure. Propaganda focused instead on successes at Stalingrad, where Operation Uranus had achieved stunning results. Operation Mars, despite being comparable in scope and preparation, was quietly minimized in official accounts. Internally, the Soviet leadership confronted the implications of the setback. Zhukov, who had been a primary architect of both Mars and Uranus, focused his attention on Stalingrad to avoid association with the costly failure in the Central Front. Soviet historians for decades afterward largely omitted detailed discussion of Mars, contributing to the operation's relative obscurity in post-war literature. Yet for the soldiers who fought and died near Rzhev during those freezing weeks, the experience was no less real or traumatic. The German command, for its part, viewed the repulsion of Operation Mars as a testament to the defensive capabilities of the Wehrmacht and the leadership of General Model. However, the price was high. The attrition sustained during the battle weakened formations that might later have reinforced the Southern Front. Moreover, the psychological toll of holding the salient under constant threat and amidst horrific conditions grew heavier with each passing month. As the year ended, the lines around Rzhev had shifted only marginally, but the soil was soaked with the blood of tens of thousands. The Soviet High Command, now fixated on exploiting the success at Stalingrad, postponed further major operations in the central sector. Yet the salient remained, a festering wound in the German front line and a looming target for the Red Army. The next phase of the Rzhev campaign would come not with bold plans of encirclement, but with brutal determination to grind down the enemy through relentless attrition. By early 1943, the situation on the Eastern Front had shifted dramatically. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad had shattered the illusion of German invincibility and forced the Wehrmacht into a strategic retreat in the south. However, the Rzhev salient still stood, an exposed protrusion of Army Group Center that stretched dangerously into Soviet-held territory. For over a year, it had resisted repeated assaults, consuming hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. Now, with the broader front lines changing and German attention pulled toward the collapsing southern sector, the Red Army prepared to launch yet another offensive in the central zone. But the character of the coming battle would not be one of bold maneuvers. It would be defined by exhaustion, attrition, and a slow, crushing advance through layers of fortified resistance. In the first weeks of 1943, the Soviet Stavka authorized Operation Kutuzov, aimed at finally collapsing the Rzhev salient and liberating the surrounding region. However, plans for its execution were still in development when a series of localized attacks were ordered to test German defenses and reduce forward enemy positions. In late January and early February, Soviet troops launched renewed attacks near Zubtsov, Sikhiovka, and the Vazuza River. These were not grand offensives, but continuous probes, bloody and persistent, in which Soviet infantry and armor clashed with entrenched German units in freezing temperatures. Conditions were abysmal. The snow lay deep in the forests and fields, making movement slow and dangerous. Vehicles became stuck, artillery sank into drifts, and soldiers often advanced knee-deep through snow under fire. German units, though weary and thinned by previous battles, continued to hold their lines with grim determination. The Ninth Army, still under General Walter Model's command, had fortified its positions over the preceding months with minefields, wire obstacles, and carefully interlocked machine gun nests. Every Soviet advance was met with overlapping fields of fire and counterattacks that blunted the momentum of even the best-prepared units. Meanwhile, behind the German front lines, logistical problems began to accumulate. Supply routes to the salient were long, exposed, and increasingly under threat from Soviet air raids and partisan activity. The Wehrmacht's fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements were stretched thin. Much of it diverted south to respond to the catastrophe at Stalingrad and the crumbling front around Rostov and Kharkov. Even the German High Command began to question the value of maintaining the salient. Von Kluge, commander of Army Group Center, joined General Seitzler, chief of the Army General Staff, in recommending a withdrawal. But Hitler remained obstinate, still convinced that holding Rzhev kept pressure on Moscow and prevented the Soviets from shifting reserves south. Within Soviet ranks, fatigue and frustration were mounting. The toll of repeated failures weighed heavily on morale. Units were understrength, replacements arrived poorly trained, and many officers were acutely aware of the futility of attacking entrenched positions head-on. Still, orders from above demanded action. Political officers enforced discipline, and retreat or hesitation could bring severe punishment. Despite overwhelming losses, the Red Army continued its grinding assault, driven not only by orders but also by vengeance for the atrocities committed in occupied territories and the desire to reclaim Russian soil. By mid-February 1943, Soviet reconnaissance began to detect signs of change within the German lines. Some positions appeared to be thinning, supply dumps were being evacuated, and troop movements indicated a possible withdrawal. What the Soviets could not yet confirm was that behind closed doors, Hitler had finally conceded. Facing pressure from multiple fronts and a dangerously overextended line, he reluctantly authorized the evacuation of the Rzhev salient. The decision, once made, was carried out with characteristic German efficiency. Codenamed Operation Buffel, the withdrawal was one of the most meticulously executed of the war. In preparation, the Wehrmacht launched widespread scorched earth actions. Bridges were destroyed, roads mined, and buildings burned to deny the Soviets any usable infrastructure. Civilians in occupied villages were forcibly evacuated or left to survive amidst the destruction. Anti-partisan operations, brutal in their execution, were intensified during the withdrawal. Soviet partisan groups attempting to harass retreating columns were met with overwhelming force. Forests were combed, and entire villages accused of collaboration were wiped out in reprisal. Despite the Soviet expectation of a final showdown to eliminate the salient, what followed was a slow, cautious advance into areas already abandoned or devastated. The Red Army found ruined fortifications, booby traps, and scorched fields where fierce defenses had once stood. While there were still isolated rearguard actions and minefield casualties, the collapse of the salient was not marked by a climactic battle but by systematic German retreat and deliberate destruction. By March 1943, the Rzhev salient no longer existed. German lines had been shortened by over 200 kilometers, allowing redeployment of divisions to the southern front. For the Soviets, the region was finally cleared, but at a staggering cost in lives and resources. The terrain was shattered, the civilian population decimated, and the memory of endless assaults lingered in the minds of survivors. The offensive had ended not with triumph, but with a grim realization of the scale of sacrifice required to reclaim every inch of land. Yet even in its end, the Battle of Rzhev remained largely absent from Soviet wartime celebrations. There was no great victory announcement, no parades. Instead, it was quietly filed away, overshadowed by more dramatic victories. But the silence could not erase what had happened. Rzhev had become a symbol of endurance and suffering, an emblem of the brutal logic of total war. And for those who had fought in the frozen forests and bloodied trenches, it would forever remain the place where death came not in moments, but in months. The conclusion of the German withdrawal from the Rzhev salient in March 1943 did not mark a true end to the suffering in the region. It merely altered its character. What had once been a battlefield saturated with movement, offensives, and counteroffensives transformed into a desolate zone of death and ruin. Soviet troops advancing through the abandoned German positions encountered a landscape that bore witness to more than a year of nearly uninterrupted combat. Villages were reduced to skeletal frames, forests were littered with corpses and rusting equipment, and minefields remained active long after the front had moved on. Operation Büffel, the German withdrawal, was in many ways a tactical success. By removing their forces from the vulnerable salient, the Wehrmacht shortened its front by hundreds of kilometers, freeing up vital divisions for use elsewhere, particularly in Ukraine, where the German southern front was now under severe threat. The Ninth Army, having withstood one of the most punishing campaigns of the Eastern Front, was able to retreat in good order. Yet, while the movement was executed skillfully, it masked a deeper strategic weakness. The German army had entered 1943 on the defensive across much of the Eastern Front, and the loss of the Rzhev salient symbolized a shifting balance of power that even Hitler's most loyal generals could not ignore. On the Soviet side, there was no celebration. Though the salient was finally erased, it was not conquered in the dramatic fashion that had been envisioned. The goal had been to crush Army Group Center, encircle its divisions, and deliver a decisive blow in the heart of German-occupied territory. Instead, the Red Army found itself inheriting a ruin, littered with traps, stripped of value, and robbed of symbolic victory. Political leadership offered little public recognition for the campaign, wary of drawing attention to the staggering cost and operational miscalculations that had plagued every phase of the Rzhev operations. The human cost of the Rzhev campaign defies easy accounting. Soviet casualty estimates are difficult to confirm due to the chaos of the front and the secrecy of official records, but conservative figures place losses well above 400,000 men. Some historians argue the number may have approached or exceeded 1 million when including the wounded, missing, and those permanently disabled. German losses were also significant, estimated between 250,000 and 300,000, though their defensive posture helped mitigate some of the bloodletting. The salient had consumed lives at a rate comparable to, and in some months greater than, the infamous battles of Stalingrad and Kursk. Survivor accounts from both sides describe the Rzhev campaign not as a series of battles, but as a continuous nightmare. Soldiers lived in trenches for weeks without rotation, subjected to daily bombardments, starvation, disease, and psychological trauma. Commanders frequently ordered attacks against fortified positions with minimal preparation, driven more by political demands than tactical necessity. Soviet tactics during the campaign remained largely frontal and attritional. And while improvements were slowly emerging in coordination and firepower, they had not yet fully matured into the operational depth seen in later years. Civilians in the Rzhev region bore the brunt of the devastation. Those who had remained during the fighting, often elderly or unable to evacuate, found themselves trapped in burned-out villages or hiding in forest dugouts. German reprisals against suspected partisans had been ruthless, and Soviet artillery often treated occupied settlements as enemy strongpoints. In the aftermath of the German retreat, what few civilians remained alive faced a humanitarian catastrophe. No shelter, no food, and vast areas still under the threat of mines and booby traps. Relief efforts were minimal, as Soviet resources remained committed to the front lines. Strategically, the elimination of the Rzhev salient marked a turning point. With the Central Front now stabilized and the threat to Moscow reduced, the Red Army could shift focus to other theaters. The resources previously consumed by the prolonged struggle for Rzhev were now available for new offensives. The Germans, too, understood that their ability to defend the vast territory they still held was dwindling. With every retreat, their forces became more concentrated, but also more exposed to Soviet numerical superiority and deep operations doctrine, which was beginning to take shape. Yet, despite the strategic implications, the Battle of Rzhev remained largely absent from public discourse. Unlike the glorified victories at Stalingrad or later at Kursk, Rzhev offered no clean narrative. It was a campaign of slaughter, where ground was measured in meters and paid for in battalions. For decades, it remained a quiet wound in the Soviet collective memory, acknowledged in whispers by veterans and historians, but rarely given its due in official commemorations. The grim silence surrounding Rzhev only amplified its tragedy. The soldiers who fought there were often forgotten, their sacrifices lost amid the noise of more decisive victories. But for the men who endured its frozen trenches, and for the civilians whose lives were shattered by its battles, Rzhev was not just another name on a map. It was a place where the Eastern Front revealed its true face, not of glory or triumph, but of relentless destruction and unending death. In the charred woods and ruined hamlets, history was written not in grand declarations, but in the silence of the dead and the scars of the living. As spring of 1943 progressed, the consequences of the Rzhev campaign continued to echo far beyond the abandoned trenches and burned-out villages. The Wehrmacht's withdrawal from the salient, though tactically executed with skill, had deeper implications for Germany's strategic posture in the East. Hitler's long-standing obsession with holding Rzhev had tied down enormous resources and shaped the deployment of entire army groups. Now, the removal of that salient allowed Army Group Center to shorten its lines. But it also revealed a fundamental shift in German strategy, from expansion to containment, from offensives to reaction. The Battle of Rzhev, in essence, was one of the last prolonged German attempts to defend a forward, overextended position deep within Soviet territory. The Ninth Army, having narrowly escaped encirclement, was redeployed to sectors where new Soviet offensives loomed. However, its battered state made it less effective. Many of its divisions were under strength, its equipment depleted, and its morale eroded by the prolonged attrition warfare at Rzhev. The divisions that had once been regarded as elite formations were now filled with new, inexperienced recruits or hastily amalgamated remnants from destroyed units. Veterans described a loss of confidence in high command, noting that even successful withdrawals were no longer signs of strategic foresight, but of necessity under pressure. On the Soviet side, lessons were being absorbed, albeit slowly and unevenly. While the Rzhev operations had failed to produce the kind of breakthrough seen at Stalingrad, they provided invaluable experience in logistics, coordination, and combined arms tactics. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, Soviet commanders had struggled to synchronize artillery barrages, infantry assaults, and armored exploitation. At Rzhev, the consequences of those failures had been catastrophic. But through those failures came a painful institutional learning process. Field commanders such as Rokossovsky, Konev, and Zhukov began to understand the limitations of frontal assaults against fortified German positions. These insights would later shape the operational art of Soviet deep battle. Doctrine that emphasized coordinated breakthroughs, operational deception, encirclement, and exploitation in depth. The hard-earned experience at Rzhev became part of a broader transformation within the Red Army that would soon bear fruit in the massive battles of Kursk, the Dnieper crossings, and the Belarusian campaign. In the months following the German withdrawal, Soviet engineering units and civilian reconstruction brigades attempted to clear the Rzhev region. The process was slow and dangerous. Mines, unexploded ordnance, and booby traps littered the terrain. Entire areas were declared uninhabitable, and hundreds of villages no longer existed on any map. Forests had been flattened by artillery fire, rivers polluted with debris and corpses, and fields rendered unusable for farming. Rebuilding would take years, and in some cases, it never fully occurred. Amidst this devastation, the psychological toll of the campaign was becoming evident. Soviet medical corps and political officers reported widespread signs of trauma among returning veterans. The long duration of the campaign, the senseless repetition of failed assaults, and the constant exposure to death had created a generation of soldiers for whom Rzhev was a byword for horror. Even in the broader context of the Eastern Front, where suffering was ubiquitous, Rzhev occupied a unique place in the minds of those who survived it. A campaign with no glory, no decisive climax, and no respite. German records, declassified after the war, revealed similar sentiments. Many Wehrmacht officers regarded Rzhev as one of the most grinding and wasteful campaigns they had ever participated in. Some even compared it unfavorably to Stalingrad, arguing that while Stalingrad had strategic importance and symbolic value, Rzhev had drained their strength without any corresponding benefit. The very decision to hold the salient for so long was increasingly questioned even within the Wehrmacht's ranks, and among junior officers, cynicism about Berlin's orders grew more pronounced. Internationally, the Rzhev campaign received little attention. Western allies focused on the Mediterranean theater and preparations for the cross-channel invasion, paid scant attention to what appeared to be static fighting in a remote region of Russia. Yet, Soviet diplomats and military attachés did occasionally mention Rzhev in their reports, often to emphasize the scale of Soviet sacrifices and the urgency of a second front in Europe. In this sense, Rzhev became not only a military engagement, but also a rhetorical tool in the broader alliance politics of the war. For the local population, those who returned or had survived in hiding, life resumed amidst ruins. Many arrived to find nothing of their former homes, and others were unable to identify the graves of loved ones. The Soviet state made some efforts to provide aid, but resources were scarce and priorities lay elsewhere. Still, people rebuilt where they could. In time, monuments would be erected, small markers at first, then larger memorials in later decades. But these came long after the scars had formed. The Rzhev campaign, by its nature, resists easy categorization. It was not a singular battle, nor a campaign that shifted the war decisively. It was a grinding, consuming struggle for a salient that many later questioned whether either side should have ever tried to hold. Yet within that struggle lay the essence of the Eastern Front, a brutal contest of endurance, shaped as much by ideology and willpower as by tactics and weapons. It was, in many ways, the war in microcosm, a place where victory was measured not in kilometers gained, but in the ability to endure. As the front lines moved westward and the wider course of the war shifted in favor of the Soviet Union, the memory of Rzhev faded from official narratives. Yet within the military command structure and the broader apparatus of the Red Army, the campaign's impact remained deeply ingrained. The experience in the Rzhev sector, painful, prolonged, and brutal, served as a harsh training ground for the Army's evolving structure, organization, and command philosophy. The attritional nightmare had tested every level of Soviet warfare, from high command to the individual rifleman, and while the campaign had failed in its immediate objectives, it had accelerated a vital transformation in how the Soviet Union conducted war. A significant consequence of Rzhev was the accelerated adaptation of Soviet defensive and offensive doctrines. Repeated failures against German prepared defenses forced Red Army staff planners to reconsider their assumptions. The pattern of sending massed infantry waves against entrenched machine guns and minefields had proven catastrophically ineffective. By mid-1943, Soviet commanders increasingly prioritized artillery saturation, coordinated air-ground operations, and carefully planned breakthrough maneuvers supported by armored reserves. The Red Army also began to adopt more flexible control systems in the field, empowering lower-level officers to make localized decisions within broader operational frameworks, something previously discouraged under rigid command hierarchies. The lessons of Rzhev also extended into military engineering and logistics. The sheer difficulty of moving men and materiel through the forests and swamps around Rzhev had exposed fundamental weaknesses in Soviet transport infrastructure. In response, the Red Army expanded its use of pontoon bridges, field railways, and specialized engineering units capable of clearing mines and booby traps with increasing efficiency. The restructuring of support units and the integration of engineering brigades into frontline operations became standard practice in later campaigns, improving the speed and effectiveness of Soviet advances across hostile terrain. Psychological resilience, too, was forged in the fires of Rzhev. Units that survived the campaign emerged as battle-hardened, if traumatized. Soviet command began to recognize the mental toll of prolonged combat exposure, though their response remained limited by ideological constraints. Political officers and commissars continued to enforce discipline, but by 1943 there was a growing awareness among commanders that sheer willpower was not enough. Efforts were made, however modest, to rotate frontline units and introduce rest cycles, though resources rarely allowed for more than brief respites. The campaign also influenced the role and tactics of Soviet partisans in occupied territories. Around Rzhev, resistance groups had operated in parallel with the Red Army's offensives, harassing German supply routes and targeting isolated garrisons. Their actions, though often uncoordinated and hampered by reprisals, laid the groundwork for more formalized collaboration between partisan networks and regular army units in subsequent operations. The experience at Rzhev highlighted the strategic value of irregular warfare, especially in undermining the logistical capacity of entrenched enemy forces. From the German perspective, the loss of the Rzhev salient marked a dangerous contraction of their strategic perimeter. While the withdrawal lightened the immediate burden on Army Group Center, it also signaled to Soviet intelligence and command that the Wehrmacht's capacity to hold deep positions was faltering. The psychological effect of this realization emboldened Soviet planning. No longer perceived as unassailable, German defensive positions began to be viewed as brittle under pressure. This shift in perception was critical in shaping the Soviet approach to the upcoming summer offensive, where lessons from Rzhev would be applied with devastating effect at Kursk. Moreover, German strategic rigidity became increasingly visible in the aftermath of Rzhev. Hitler's interference in military operations, already a well-known issue, had been acutely problematic throughout the campaign. His insistence on holding the salient for prestige reasons, long after it had become a liability, had cost the Wehrmacht dearly. Many German officers, while publicly obedient, expressed growing frustration in internal communications. This erosion of trust between high command and field officers would deepen in later stages of the war, particularly after the collapse at Stalingrad and the failures in the Battle of Kursk. At a broader societal level, the Rzhev campaign contributed to the Soviet population's evolving understanding of the war as one of total sacrifice. While propaganda emphasized heroism and ultimate victory, returning veterans carried a different story, one of endless combat, unbearable losses, and the brutal indifference of higher command to individual suffering. These experiences began to subtly shift public sentiment. Even under strict censorship, the names of villages around Rzhev became whispered symbols of tragedy. Letters from the front, heavily redacted, hinted at horrors that official newspapers never mentioned. In this way, Rzhev became a quiet monument to the cost of victory, a chapter written not in headlines but in memory and silence. Finally, the logistical and environmental consequences of the Rzhev campaign endured long after the front moved on. The landscape itself had been permanently altered. Massive deforestation, erosion, and destruction of arable land created lasting ecological scars. The network of trenches, bunkers, and craters remained visible for years. Thousands of unexploded shells and mines lay buried beneath the soil, continuing to maim and kill long after the shooting stopped. In some places, local populations refused to return, leaving entire regions depopulated. In retrospect, the Battle of Rzhev can be seen not only as a test of arms, but as a crucible for military evolution. It was in those devastated woods and frozen fields that the Red Army began to shed the limitations of its earlier years and forge a more formidable, adaptive war machine. The cost was staggering, the process cruel, but from the wreckage emerged a fighting force capable of taking the offensive, not just in spirit, but in strategy and execution. Rzhev had broken bodies, but it had also reshaped minds, and in that transformation, the seeds of Soviet ascendancy on the Eastern Front were sown. In the months that followed the German retreat from the Rzhev salient, the Soviet Union shifted its military focus to operations that would culminate in the colossal clash at Kursk. Yet even as attention turned southward, the psychological and institutional legacy of Rzhev continued to influence decision-making at all levels of command. The Soviet High Command, emboldened by hard-earned lessons and the growing maturity of its military apparatus, began preparing to confront the Wehrmacht in battles of maneuver and exploitation rather than static attrition. Rzhev had served as the final proving ground for these new approaches, and the crucible from which a new generation of Soviet military leadership emerged. One of the most significant transformations that followed the campaign was the evolution of operational depth theory from a theoretical framework into a practical doctrine. The Red Army's inability to break through German lines at Rzhev using sheer force had demonstrated the futility of attacking prepared positions without sequential, layered planning. The Stavka and its field commanders, many of whom had suffered through the attritional disasters of 1942, now emphasized deep penetrations, coordination between combined arms groups, and encirclement strategies designed to collapse enemy formations rather than grind them down directly. The development and deployment of new Soviet weaponry and military technology also gained momentum in the aftermath of Rzhev. The T-34 tank had already proven its value, but during and after the campaign, tactical refinements were implemented regarding its usage. Tank brigades were reorganized for greater cohesion with infantry and artillery units, and operational doctrine shifted to exploit breakthroughs rather than force them single-handedly. Similarly, the Soviet artillery arm underwent improvements in both fire control and mobility, learning to concentrate massive firepower ahead of attacks in ways that shattered even deeply entrenched positions. Lessons painfully extracted from the failures of the Vazuza and Sikevka sectors. Rzhev also catalyzed improvements in military intelligence. Throughout the campaign, Soviet commanders had suffered from inaccurate or outdated maps, poor estimates of German strength, and inadequate reconnaissance. By 1943, greater emphasis was placed on aerial reconnaissance, partisan intelligence gathering, and the integration of frontline reports into high-level planning. The Red Army began to construct a more realistic picture of German operational patterns, allowing for more nuanced responses and adaptive decision-making. This shift would later prove critical in anticipating German movements during Operation Citadel. Culturally, the memory of Rzhev had begun to take shape among soldiers as a symbol of endurance rather than victory. Unlike the triumphal rhetoric that surrounded Stalingrad, the veterans of Rzhev returned with a sense of grim detachment. They had not won territory or achieved strategic glory. They had simply survived. Letters from soldiers described the fighting not as noble or patriotic, but as a continuous slaughter in which progress was measured in burned villages and the shifting of trench lines by meters. Yet this very experience forged a hardened core of non-commissioned officers and junior commanders, whose knowledge of German defenses, minefield patterns, and counterattack doctrines would become invaluable in future engagements. Within German military circles, the withdrawal from Rzhev caused introspection. General Walter Model, who had overseen the defense of the salient, retained his reputation as a master of flexible defensive warfare, but the loss of the position marked a psychological concession. It was increasingly apparent to the German command that they could no longer maintain forward salients at great distance from their logistic bases without incurring unsustainable losses. This realization influenced German strategic planning for 1943 and beyond, leading to a greater focus on constructing defensive belts and fortified lines, particularly around Kursk, which the Soviets would soon target. The Rzhev campaign also provided an example of the complex relationship between political authority and military decision-making in both warring states. In the Soviet Union, the Stavka's continued insistence on attacking the salient, despite repeated failures, underscored the degree to which ideological considerations, reclaiming Soviet soil, demonstrating offensive momentum, could override operational realities. However, the eventual shift in tactics and the belated authorization of more flexible approaches showed that learning was possible, even under a centralized and heavily politicized system. In contrast, Hitler's insistence on holding the salient for symbolic reasons, long after its strategic value had diminished, revealed the growing irrationality of German high command decision-making. The cost of this stubbornness was measured not just in men and material, but in strategic initiative. For those on the ground, however, these higher-level dynamics were remote. What remained was the landscape of destruction, fields still poisoned by explosives, forests splintered into matchsticks, and rivers swollen with the runoff of war. In the spring and summer of 1943, teams of Soviet engineers and civilians continued the painstaking work of clearing the area. Mine-clearing units advanced meter by meter, probing the earth for buried charges. Recovery units exhumed mass graves, identifying fallen comrades when possible, and reinterring them in makeshift cemeteries. The wounded, many amputees, or suffering from frostbite-related complications, filled hospitals from Kalinin to Moscow. Amid this recovery, Soviet authorities began the process of renaming streets, rebuilding roads, and issuing medals. Yet little of this activity reflected the grim truths of the campaign. Official histories offered only vague references to heavy fighting west of Moscow, while the names of villages like Polonino, Belly, and Karmanovo rarely entered public discourse. It would take decades for the Rzhev campaign to be fully acknowledged, and even longer for memorials to be built at the sites of its worst battles. The silence surrounding the campaign was not accidental. It was a reflection of its ambiguity, its lack of resolution, and the sheer cost of its indecisive bloodletting. In retrospect, the experience of Rzhev was not only a military lesson, but also a political one. The Soviet leadership had pushed the Red Army into a series of operations with unrealistic expectations and insufficient planning. But through the failure came recalibration. The Red Army that emerged from Rzhev was not yet the unstoppable force that would drive to Berlin. But it was no longer the blunt instrument of 1941. It was learning, adapting, and growing stronger in the worst possible circumstances. The losses had been enormous, but the transformation was underway. In that sense, the Rzhev campaign was not a victory, but it was a turning point. By the autumn of 1943, the broader contours of the Eastern Front had changed irrevocably. Why? The Battle of Kursk had ended in a decisive Soviet victory, and German forces were retreating across multiple sectors. The Red Army now pursued a dynamic, strategic offensive across Ukraine, Belarus, and into the Baltic regions. Yet behind these headlines, the legacy of Rzhev lingered, its effects visible in how operations were planned, executed, and evaluated. For both Soviet and German commands, the experience of that bloody salient continued to inform doctrine, influence morale, and shape expectations about what future battles might demand. Within the Soviet military establishment, commanders who had proven adaptable during Rzhev were increasingly promoted. Generals such as Konstantin Rokossovsky and Ivan Konev, who had weathered the attritional nightmare with strategic patience and insight, now held key commands in larger operations. Their operational style had matured. No longer reliant on sheer frontal assault, they favored deception operations, rapid breakthroughs, and coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and air support. These were the commanders who had internalized the harsh lessons of Rzhev, the cost of underestimating a fortified enemy, the futility of attrition without exploitation, and the necessity of maintaining momentum once a breach was achieved. Soviet operational art evolved accordingly. Multi-layered offensives were now standard, often designed to pull German reserves in one direction before delivering a decisive blow elsewhere. The ability to mask the true axis of advance, maintain operational secrecy, and saturate key sectors with overwhelming firepower distinguished Soviet offensives in 1943 and 1944. These were precisely the elements that had been absent or underdeveloped during Rzhev. In this way, the failed operations of 1942–43 bore indirect responsibility for the stunning Soviet successes that followed. Meanwhile, on the German side, the repercussions of Rzhev were becoming apparent in the erosion of manpower, material, and confidence. Although the Wehrmacht had managed to extricate itself from the salient with discipline, the price had been high. Many divisions had been bled dry. Replacements were fewer, less trained, and more often drawn from occupied territories. The German army's qualitative edge, once a pillar of its eastern operations, was beginning to erode under the cumulative pressure of prolonged campaigns like Rzhev. The psychological strain on German soldiers who had served in the salient was profound. Letters and reports revealed a growing sense of futility, of fighting for ground that was ultimately abandoned, of holding out against massive offensives only to be ordered to retreat days later. Some officers expressed open resentment at having been sacrificed for a position they knew to be indefensible in the long term. Others, particularly among junior ranks, simply burned out. Desertions rose, and disciplinary incidents became more frequent in units with high exposure to the Rzhev campaign. The Wehrmacht's morale, though still capable of discipline and resistance, had taken a blow from which it would not fully recover. At a structural level, the German army shifted into a more defensive posture after Rzhev. Hitler's failed gamble to maintain a forward position, regardless of cost, became a cautionary tale within the German General Staff. From late 1943 onward, emphasis was placed on defense in depth, the construction of field fortifications, and counter-mobility measures. This approach manifested in the layered defenses at Kursk, and later along the Dnieper Line and the Panther-Wotan positions. The idea was to create attritional depth to delay the Soviet advance, but ironically, it mimicked many of the same problems experienced at Rzhev: static defenses, overextended logistics, and inflexible strategic planning. On the home front, both the Soviet and German populations remained largely unaware of the full scale of the Rzhev tragedy. In the USSR, the campaign was overshadowed by more dramatic and celebratory narratives. It did not serve the political purposes of the regime to highlight a campaign defined by horrific losses, limited gains, and strategic ambiguity. German propaganda, too, avoided the subject, preferring to portray the Eastern Front as a series of heroic stands rather than a slow, grinding loss of ground. Only those who had fought there, on either side, understood what the Rzhev salient had truly demanded. The veterans themselves carried those memories in silence. For many Soviet soldiers, Rzhev was a place they preferred not to speak about. In memoirs and interviews recorded decades later, common themes emerged: frozen trenches, endless shellfire, senseless orders, the constant presence of death. Some compared it to Verdun or the Somme, but with less recognition and no finality. German veterans spoke in similar tones: of forests that consumed entire battalions, of bunkers that became tombs, of endless waiting followed by brief, ferocious combat that achieved nothing. It was a shared trauma, even among enemies. In military academies and staff colleges, however, Rzhev was studied with intensity. Soviet planners dissected the failures and drew out methodologies that would inform operations like Bagration. The attrition, while terrible, had exposed systemic weaknesses in communication, mobility, reconnaissance, and command cohesion that could be addressed. For the Germans, Rzhev served as a warning of what happened when doctrine ossified, when politics dictated strategy, and when initiative was sacrificed for the illusion of control. Ultimately, the turning point of the Rzhev campaign was not a single moment or a battle. It was the quiet, brutal realization that the war on the Eastern Front would not be won by defending salients or launching underprepared offensives. It would be won by those who learned, who adapted, and who could sustain momentum over months and years of unrelenting struggle. The Soviets learned that at Rzhev. The Germans in many ways did not. And so, as the war moved past the forests of Rzhev and into the broad plains of Ukraine and Poland, the scars remained. They were etched not only into the land, but into the minds of those who had fought there. The campaign had changed them. It had changed their armies. And it had changed the course of the war. Not with a bang, but with a long, slow, grinding hemorrhage of strength. The final legacy of the Battle of Rzhev lies not in the shifting of front lines or the names etched on maps, but in the profound effect it had on the conduct, psychology, and memory of the Eastern Front. It was a campaign that never ended in triumph, only in silence. No grand surrender, no encircled army, no liberated capital. Yet its consequences would reverberate through every Soviet and German decision that followed. Militarily, politically, and culturally, it was, in every sense, a war of erasure, of villages, divisions, identities, and ultimately recognition. In the immediate post-war years, the Soviet Union emerged victorious and triumphant, but narratives of that victory were carefully curated. Rzhev, with its appalling losses and strategic ambiguity, did not fit the story the state wished to tell. Unlike the siege of Leningrad or the defense of Stalingrad, the Rzhev campaign could not be distilled into a tale of heroic resistance or glorious counteroffensive. It was too complex, too painful, too reflective of systemic flaws. As a result, it was largely excluded from official histories. Veterans of Rzhev rarely received the recognition afforded to those who fought in more celebrated campaigns. Their stories, when told, were often passed down in private, in whispered recollections rather than public commemoration. It was not until the late Soviet period and post-Soviet era that the campaign began to receive more thorough historical attention. Memoirs, declassified documents, and independent research slowly reconstructed the staggering scale and brutality of the Rzhev battles. A more nuanced understanding emerged, one that acknowledged both the strategic necessity and the operational miscalculations, the heroism and the horror. For many, the campaign came to symbolize the anonymous sacrifice that underpinned the Soviet war effort. The thousands of unmarked graves, the unnamed villages, the forgotten offensives that bought time and blood for later victories. Monuments began to appear, most notably the massive Rzhev Memorial to the Soviet soldier, unveiled in 2020. Its towering figure of a soldier, dissolving into a flock of birds, captures the essence of the campaign. An army that bled not for glory, but because it had to. The memorial is not simply a tribute to victory. It is an acknowledgement of suffering, a recognition that endurance and loss were as integral to the Soviet path to Berlin as any battlefield success. For many families, it serves as the only tangible reminder of relatives who never returned and whose fates were never fully known. In Germany, Rzhev was never the subject of widespread public discourse. The war in the East was largely viewed through the lens of the Stalingrad disaster and later the collapse of the Reich. But among military historians and veterans circles, Rzhev held a particular place of dread. German officers who had served there regarded it as one of the most punishing environments of the entire war, a place where their tactical skill meant little against the relentless waves of Soviet assaults and the unforgiving terrain. It became shorthand for a type of war that stripped away illusions, reducing combat to survival and position holding to attrition. Strategically, Rzhev had delayed the Soviet advance, but at a cost the Germans could ill afford. It drained divisions, burned through supplies, and forced commanders to commit to static defenses when maneuver was no longer viable. The eventual withdrawal from the salient represented a quiet admission that the initiative had slipped away. It was not a collapse, but a concession, one that opened the path to the Soviet operational victories of 1943 and 1944. For the Red Army, the campaign left a dual legacy. On one hand, it revealed deep flaws in Soviet command, communication, and offensive planning. On the other, it hardened the institution, forcing reforms and adaptations that would be essential in the campaigns to come. By enduring Rzhev, the Red Army passed through one of its darkest crucibles and emerged more capable, more determined, and better led. It was a transformation paid for in bodies, not headlines. In the broader context of the Second World War, Rzhev stands as a reminder of the hidden battles, those not immortalized in film or celebrated in national myths. It is a case study in what modern industrial total war truly demanded: the absorption of horrific losses without breaking, the execution of impossible orders with limited means, the capacity to kill and be killed with no clear result. It was not glamorous, and it was not decisive, but it was real, and in many ways it defined the war in the East more than any single victory. Today, Rzhev is once again a quiet place, The forests have returned, the trenches have filled with earth, and the rivers flow over forgotten bones. But memory endures. In every book written, every name recovered, and every wreath laid in silence, the story of the Rzhev campaign continues to unfold, not as a tale of triumph, but as a testimony to sacrifice, a place where history bled into the soil, and where war showed its truest, most unforgiving face.